clearly evident from their faces. The police force marched the Republic Square, and the events that took place after that would not have been predicted by anyone. They started protesting the unlawful orders that were being issued to them by the government. Soon, officials of the defense force were deployed to counter the police and to try and convince them to reconsider their actions. However, the number of protesting police officers kept increasing. Then, recently resigned President Mohammad Nasheed even attended the protest and asked the police to drop their arms and to give in to the MNDF, promising them no harm if they did that. When he attended the protest, neither the police commissioner Ahmed Fasih nor Home Minister Hassan Afif had addressed the situation. Police, however, did not allow Nasheed to address them and called on the authorities to free the uniformed bodies. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, the first clashes erupted between police and the armed forces. The MNDF first used a large amount of tear gas and started filing into the Republic Square. The police who were protesting took up the challenge and confronted them. MNDF officials then fired rubber bullets against the police and other protesters. But police did not relent. With the help of shields that their allies at the police headquarters threw to them, they confronted the army, while civilian protesters threw stones and other objects at the MNDF officials. That resulted in the MNDF going back into the army headquarters. While these confrontations were going on, no one knew the exact location of Mohammad Nasheed. However, witnesses said that he was in the MNDF headquarters. Suddenly, celebratory cheers erupted in the Republic Square when some officials of the police defected to the opposition. More MNDF officials kept joining the police protesters, and MNDF and police officials from nearby islands also came to Male to join the protest. What we heard after that was that protesters from the uniformed bodies had set conditions for the government. They demanded the president to resign by 1:30 and for the police commissioner Ahmed Fasih and his two assistants to resign as well. They said that the conditions were not negotiable. The police commissioner Ahmed Fasih was the first to give in to the conditions set by the opposing forces when he resigned. After realizing the situation and the mindset of police and defense force, former President Mohammad Nasheed also decided to resign. He announced his decision at a press conference held at President's office at 1 o'clock.
Adi Rajya etak ginaguna jelluntuke vidana kama aluganda fena tire aluganda mirajege raisu jumhuriya kamu niyetum peshide istifati.
Although he announced that he resigned voluntarily, less than 24 hours into his resignation, President Nasheed and his allies started claiming that he was forced to resign at gunpoint. That was a summary of the events that led to former President Mohammad Nasheed's resignation. We have in the studio South Kutti MP Mohammad Nasheed to comment on the crisis. You said earlier that the former president deemed himself all-powerful, and we have seen that he has a lot of power, especially in the international community. We have media groups coming to Maldives to cover this event and covering exclusively the perspective of former President Nasheed. And talking to international media at his residence today, President Nasheed said that he hoped the international community would act quickly to prevent his detention or arrest. What pressures can the international community put on the Wahid administration?
I meant he was all-powerful in a totally different local political context. I meant that he was a very strong executive president. He had a very substantial number of MPs in parliament. He had a large party. It had a good infrastructure. His political connectivity, political networking was very strong, and he had all the criteria required to sustain his presidency. And that was what I meant by an all-powerful president who was surprised that he was asked to go home 2 years ahead of elections. But yes, he also enjoys very strong democratic credentials in the international community. You should know that he came to power after a prolonged struggle for democracy political space, greater freedom and human rights. These are very sensational slogans, very catchy ones that catches the eye of the international community somehow very quickly. And he had a track record of sustained crusade for human rights, democracy, and freedom of various fundamental liberties. So I think he enjoys these credentials even today to an extent because of the past track record of his, and which the international community is very well aware of. And they also believe that that was the fight for those fundamental liberties, human rights and democracy that catapulted him to power in 2008 as well. So he was seen as a champion of democracy who succeeded in becoming president on that platform. And definitely in a 100% Muslim country that had a democratic deficit for a very long period of time, it was a fascinating event for the international community. It was a good transition, it was a peaceful transition to democracy. And they would all put their support behind a person who would want to lead an administration on those premises of democracy, human rights, and fundamental liberties. So naturally, he has a relationship with the international community, a very powerful, a very meaningful relationship, and they are still willing to help him, until the very resignation. I'm sure they would have continued to support him, and they would also not want undue harm to come his way even now. So that way, I think they will want to get involved in these issues. Not that they want to get involved in our domestic affairs, but they would like to engage with the current government and see how a more peaceful transition can be made to the next government. And also that there be not undue harm coming President Nasheed's way, and that if anything does happen, it happens through a due process. That there is a constitution, there are established laws, there are established procedures. So even if he were to be brought before the law for any of his past actions, that be done justifiably within the law and according to due process. And that there be no personal acts of vengeance or emotion or passion directed at him. I think to that extent, the international community will be very concerned. But I don't think international community will go to the extent of saying we still want President Nasheed to be kept in power. I think that's a wrong conclusion to derive from the engagement we have with the international community.
Well, talking about the international community, the international media are calling the events that unfolded on Tuesday a police mutiny. What do you think it actually was? Was it a police mutiny?
I wouldn't say it's a police mutiny. I would say it's a very strong word to use against our police forces. And for mutiny, I think two factors have to be completed. There has to be a duly constituted authority, and there has to be a lawful command. Our police protested against an unlawful command, a command that they thought was totally outside the law. Not only they thought, courts have deemed to be totally outside the law and totally outside the constitution. So no police officer, no military officer in this country is asked to follow or is required to follow an extra legal or extra constitutional command coming from even a duly constituted authority. This is very unique for Maldives. Very few countries have provisions written in the constitution itself governing this area of obedience or compliance with unlawful directions or orders. Our constitution has it in two provisions. One applicable generally to all civilians, one applicable specifically to all uniformed services. Now, the one that applies generally to all civilians gives civilians a right to not follow. Like Article 64, for example, says that nobody must issue a command except he is empowered to do so by law. And if that kind of a command is directed to a person, he has a right not to follow it. Okay, so that right is given, that freedom to choose to follow or not to follow is given. But there is a similar provision which is directed specifically at the security services or the uniformed services in Article 245, which says that no one shall issue an unlawful command to one in these forces. And even if it is issued, no one in these two services shall follow it. So it's an absolute command, not the constitution itself commands the uniformed services not to follow unlawful orders. So I think police mutiny is a phrase that must be understood in our context. It was not mutiny because it was not a rebellion against a constituted authority, and it was not a rebellion against, it was not a refusal to follow a lawful command issued by a constituted authority. Yes, the president is a duly constituted authority, of course. So is the commissioner of police. He is a duly constituted authority. But their orders must be lawful. What the police did not follow was an unlawful command which they were fully within their rights not to follow. Therefore, it cannot, what they did cannot be equated to a mutiny. I disagree with the term altogether. All we can say is they were simply drawing a line that they would not follow any unlawful commands any further, and that they would like all these commands to be kept within the law. I think that was the point they made, and that cannot be equated to mutiny.
And now we take a short break. Please stay tuned for more on this topic. Welcome back. We have in the studio the South Khabaruthereinn MP, who also served as the former legal reform minister, who is giving his opinion on the events that are unfolding in the country right now. As you know, when President Nasheed came into power in 2008, he pledged that the country's economy would be better during his term. But things happened and it has taken a turn for the worse. And what do you think that the Wahid administration could do in this situation? Do you think that in the time that is remaining for Dr. Wahid, do you think that he would be able to make the economy take a turn for the better?
President Wahid has been the vice president serving with President Nasheed when these policies were formulated and brought into action. So therefore, he doesn't need to learn these policies afresh or anew. He knows they were developed with them together. So with President Nasheed gone and President Wahid now acting in his behalf, or rather taking his position, I think he has the background relating to these policies, how and why they are formulated. And he probably would have had also the time to form his own opinions about these policies, whether they were substantially good or substantially bad, whether any of them needed reorientation or fine-tuning here and there, or whether any of these policies needed to be abandoned. I'm sure it would have crossed his mind throughout the 3 years he spent as vice president with President Nasheed. Now he has nearly 2 years, well, effectively 1.5 years, because election fever would set in a few months before the inaugural date, right? So he has 1.5 years to finally make a decision about those opinions he must have had all this while. If he feels that certain policies are good, he's totally within his powers to continue with them. If he feels any of the policies needs to be changed, he's totally within his powers to do that as well. And if he wants to even abandon some of the policies, he's totally within his powers to do that as well. So it's very much up to President Wahid and his new cabinet that would be set up hopefully soon, that would want to do an audit of these policies and see what needs to be continued and what needs to be seized or what needs to be dropped. I think until that happens, what President Nasheed had started will continue unaffected, because we also should believe in a degree of continuity. So I think, but the kind of serious damage that